In 2023, hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed or suffered injuries globally amid armed conflict, according to the UN High Commissioner Office. Volker Turk, UN Human Rights Chief, said he's horrified by the doubling of women and the tripling of children being killed. He made the remarks during the ongoing 56th regular session of the Human Rights Council.
Killings and injuries of civilians have become a daily occurrence. Destruction of vital infrastructure a daily occurrence. Devastating and reckless. Children shot at. Hospitals bombed. Heavy artillery launched on entire communities. All along with hateful, divisive and dehumanizing rhetoric.
Referring to the Gaza Strip, he said he was appalled by the disregard for international human rights and humanitarian law by parties to the conflict. Pointing to Africa, Turk highlighted a range of conflicts, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan and South Sudan, among others.
I'm dismayed by the extent to which warring parties have pushed beyond the boundaries of what is acceptable and legal on many fronts, with utter contempt for the other, trampling human rights at their core.
More than 219,000 victims of armed conflict were reported in the DRC. South Sudan saw at least 1,500 civilian killings, while in Sudan, about 12,000 people were killed after conflict erupted over a year ago. The UN Human Rights Chief stressed that there is an urgent need to find a way back to peace. Caroline B., CGTN.
We're now joined by Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director of the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Greetings to you, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us in Africa Live. Doctor, the UN says that global conflicts killed 3 times as many children and twice as many women last year than in the previous year, 2022. Just how bad is the situation, especially here in Africa?
The situation is particularly dire, especially within this region of the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, as well as parts of Central Africa. In part, not because these are new conflicts, but because I think the emergence of the new conflicts, especially in the Middle East, have now turned this into forgotten conflicts. And today, as we speak, thousands of refugees, both internally displaced as well as externally, a significant proportion of that is actually made up of women and children. And so is the number of deaths as well as other casualties. And so the situation is pretty unfortunate. But again, this is something that's likely to continue if something is not done in the meantime.
And I was going to ask you about your expectations for 2024 with raging conflict in Sudan, the DRC, and parts of the Sahel region as well.
Considering the lack of focused attention on this conflict, we're likely to see an increase in humanitarian situation, as well as the refugee question, which, of course, increasingly, it has not received sufficient attention compared, for instance, to some of the conflicts that are going on in Europe. Second, you're likely to see proliferation of armed conflicts, especially in parts of Sudan, as well as the Democratic Republic of Congo, in part because of the diplomatic efforts have either stalled or have failed in some of those places. And so, even as I think the world grapples with what is happening, the challenge is there aren't sufficient efforts to be able to contain the kind of problem that we are going to foresee in 2024.
Some of these conflicts, Doctor, especially here in Africa, have been going on for far too long. What do you think governments, regional and international bodies can and should do to help resolve the situations in those countries?
Many of internal conflicts are one of the challenges, of course, is the grievance when it comes to a lack of inclusion. And so governments generally and nations should move in the direction of having more inclusive representation and inclusive governments to prevent the grievance of political exclusion. But regionally, they need to be a move by regional bodies to be strengthened in a way in which they can be able to intervene and support mediation as well as peace processes. Today, as we speak, the regional bodies, the African Union, IGAD, as well as ECOWAS, they are not sufficiently, I think, empowered and coordinated in a way that can be able to contribute sufficiently with carrots and sticks to make sure that it works. But internationally, I think the forgotten conflicts need to be revisited. There's been a lot of focus on the conflict, for instance, in Europe, in Ukraine, and of course the emerging conflict in Gaza in the Middle East. But the conflicts in DRC, conflicts in Sudan, in Ethiopia, as well as elsewhere in the Sahel region, I think have been forgotten. And I think there need to be renewed efforts as well as diplomatic engagement on the continent across the spectrum.
Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Hassan Kanenje, Director of the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies, and he was speaking to us from right here in Nairobi, Kenya.